The first time that I ever learned how genetics work, as well as what nature versus nurture is, and after years of doing research and also being involved within the neuroscience community, I was able to connect some of these dots and realize that it's really pity, because if you are handed bad genes, but in addition to that, you're handed the bad environment, you're pretty much stuck. Having said that, there are always those outliers where people do come out differently from the bad cards of nature and nurture that they were handed. While there are no studies studying those particular personalities, we do have some scientific background in terms of those who are big thinkers, in my opinion, who are, for example, extremely creative or scientists and so forth, in comparison to those who are not. But it still remains a hot topic, in my mind at least, that those who are big thinkers tend to still, even after they've achieved a lot, look back and realize that they didn't think big enough, because you always have the unfortunate way of thinking that you could have done more and could have reached more and could have thought bigger, so to speak. And if you're a person who were handed those two cards that were both bad, then you're in bad luck, and a lot of us are in that boat. And the way in which we could handle it, in my own opinion, is to partly make peace with it and partly just keep going, knowing that your starting point was kind of not fair, because those cards were not handed rightly. But it is what it is, and the fact that we're here just because dinosaur went extinct, so we are more or less really not meant to be here anyway, so we can just go with it. And one of those studies is something that I wanted to share with you guys today. This study, led by UCLA's health scientists, showed that highly creative people's brains appear to work differently from others, with an atypical approach that makes distant connections more quickly by passing the hubs seen in a non-creative brains. In other words, their brain appeared to take the road less traveled to their destination. Exceptionally creative or scientific or business-minded folks in the study, called Big Cs, volunteered to undergo this fMRI study, and the results showed that these folks had unique brain connectivity that tended to stay off the beaten path. In other words, the path that was habitual, the path that was always taken. The brain of these folks appeared to take another path and connect with different brain tissues, for example. Although the concept of, for example, creativity or being a big thinker has been studied for decades, little is known about the biological basis, and even less about the brain mechanics of these very exceptional people. And so this study, uniquely designed in a way to be able to study these folks and look at their brain structures and the way in which their brain connected by using, for example, the fMRI technology. And one of the findings of this study was that the exceptional these exceptional folks was associated with more random connectivity at the global scale, a pattern that is less efficient but would appear to be helpful in linking distant brain nodes. If we were to compare the brain connectivity and the brain mechanism of these big thinkers, in terms of, for example, taking flights and having layovers, while everyone else is, for example, stuck in a 3-hour layover at a major airport, these big thinkers and highly exceptional people tend to take the private planes directly to a distant destination. And this is apparently how their brain connectivity works. This more random connectivity may be less efficient much of the time, but the architecture enables the brain activity to take a road less traveled and make novel connections. And that is how the brain of these exceptional folks at the architecture and connectivity level differs from others. Researchers also here say that the fact that these big thinkers and exceptional people had more efficient local brain connectivity, but only under certain conditions, may relate to their expertise, consistent with some of our prior findings. These exceptional folks may not need to work as hard as other smart people to perform certain creative tasks. For example, these scientists and these artists that were doing these studies, they were nominated by panels of experts before even being validated as exceptionals based on some of the objective metrics. The SMART comparison group was recruited from participants in a previous, for example, UCLA studies who had agreed to be contacted for possible participation in future studies. The study also showed that while these exceptional folks, participants, subject of this study, were engaged in tasks, their brain tended to make more random connections on the global scale compared to other participants, which showed that highly big thinkers, creative people, had unique brain connectivity that tended to stay off the beaten path. In other words, road less traveled, based on these UCLA scientists. Brainwaves activities also appear to be somehow connected with highly creative people. And again, when we mention creativity, it's not just about the arts, it's sciences, businesses, etc. Some scientists have linked the strength of alpha waves to different levels of creativity. One study measured these EEG alpha brainwaves frequencies while participants solved verbal problems, and individuals were asked to come up with, for example, as many original solutions as possible. And the results showed that the most creative solutions were accompanied by measurable increases in alpha brainwaves activities. And other research has shown similar matches between creative acts and alpha waves, and it seems that there is a huge connection there as well. And if you remember, alpha waves are the ones that are lower in frequencies in comparison to beta and gamma. Now, obviously, these are not the only studies that exist. There have been many studies done regarding the topic, but the ones that are that I have been interested in looking at is when and if they do the comparison between the two different groups. And hopefully in the future, some scientists will also look into the way in which this comparison can be made between the individuals who do have the different cards that they've been given in terms of nature versus nurture. Regardless, it still begs the question as to why that is. And if you are one of those thinkers who think about these things a lot, I highly encourage you to not give up, although sometimes it's very, very easy to give up. But one thing that I've noticed helps is a combination of physical activities with cognitive activities, and that appears to really help the brain functions to sort of not collapse and still continue to work in hopefully big way of thinking. And from my personal experience, every time I do that, I sort of get back in line with what I am doing and what I'm supposed to do. But it is still a huge question, I think, in our world in terms of when we think about these huge questions as to what is the difference in terms of big thinkers and the rest of the population. With the explosion of AI, robotics, and so forth, while very exciting, I think a lot of us also have this existential questions as to what humans would mean in the future or in the near future. But personally, I think it's a very exciting time, but the existential questions do come in hand from time to time, especially for those of us who think a lot, in terms of scientific terms, and have pondered a lot about what life is, what meaning of life is, and especially those of us who are in the scientific world and continue doing our scientific research. But one thing I also notice is that the environment that we put ourselves in is very important. And so if you are a person who feels like an outlier because you feel like your talents are not being nurtured enough, maybe it is a real good time to change the environment, because we also know scientifically that the environment is extremely important, even if it was not given to us since birth. When we are adults, we can, and to some extent, have the power to change it, even in small ways. And that could be, for example, the people you surround yourself with, or the places you hang out within, or the environment you even live within. That has huge impact on the way in which we, for example, also live our lives. And so if that is something that I think any person feels, we should also do something about it, because changing that environment or the people also tend to have a huge impact, especially if we are put ourselves in a places where we are maybe acknowledged or appreciated or seen. That also usually gives a motivation. And if we don't have the means to change that environment, it could be as little as just watching, for example, YouTube channels that talk about the ideas or the big ideas that we're thinking about. That could motivate us to help us move forward, or reading books as well. Any type of content that we can consume that corresponds to what our inner world wants. Okay, that's all I had for today. Thanks for watching and tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.